What's up, Coach TJ?
Hello.
What's up?
Wow, that's something energetic and special.
I wanted to bring something new. It's a rainy day here, so I'm trying to psych myself up and get things get the stoke going.
I love your stoke. I also love a rainy day.
Yeah.
In August.
It's been a nice break from the 90-degree heat.
Yeah. Well, it's good to see you.
Yeah, stoked to be back here.
Good to be back in the studio here.
Back in the studio. We have an awesome show lined up today. We've got some hot or nots that I'm really stoked to get into. Then we're going to talk a little bit about my approach to Leadville and how we plan for 100-mile races. And again, I think there's takeaways for athletes racing any distance about sort of the level of intention and preparation that you should be putting into your event. Then we're going to talk a little bit about carb loading as part of that discussion. We're going to go deep into the history and the science behind carb loading.
Oh my gosh, the history.
The history is fascinating.
So this is not about primal diets.
It is not. This is going to be a high carb podcast.
Excellent.
And then we're going to finish with a discussion on tips for getting better at running downhill. We talked about how to get faster at running uphill a few weeks ago. Check out that podcast called How to Get Better at Running Uphill. And we wanted to talk about some really specific ways that runners can feel stronger and more confident running downhill on trail, particularly on technical and steep downhills.
All right.
Which you identify as a downhill athlete.
Downhill athlete.
Yes. So I'll be really picking your brain because I think out of the two of us, you're the stronger downhiller for sure.
Excuse me while I sip my NA beer.
We both are carb loading with non-alcoholic beers.
Yeah, how many carbs are in this?
Let's check. Carb check. I have
Mine
11 grams in mine.
I don't have grams here, I don't think. Oh, I do. Ooh, 17. Yeah.
It's like the same as a thing of scratch. We'll get to that later. I calculated
same
out.
as a thing of spring energy.
Yeah, same as a thing of spring energy. Incredible.
Not too soon.
Awesome sauce. Almost as carbohydrate rich as a non-alcoholic Blue Moon. But I'm really stoked to get into all of this. So
let's do it.
Kick things off. Hot or not, Coach TJ, pacing someone for an ultra distance. And by that, I mean the amount of time or the amount of distance you're covering and supporting your friend is longer than an ultra.
Okay, I'm going to piss some people off here that I coach and that are direct friends of mine who I love dearly. And, okay, not hot. Pacing ultra distances.
Tell me why.
Not hot. And that is to say, if you're pacing someone, your racer should be doing an ultra distance. You should not be doing an ultra distance. It is very unhot. One, a lot can go wrong in an ultra. Mm-hmm. So why put yourself in a position where you could become an issue for the person who's trying to go that distance? I think that's just rule number one here for me.
I mean, there's a huge, I feel like in most hundreds, I feel like pacing legs usually are anywhere from 10, 12 miles to maybe 22, 25 at the longest usually, which is significant. And that's an amount of time. When I paced you at Western States, I built that into my training. I did a little bit of a taper, but I was actually just planning on doing 6 miles with you and ended up doing about a marathon or just under a marathon. And that was pretty different, right? Before Silver, and I'm an experienced enough effort. I'm an experienced enough athlete that I can make those decisions, and I was healthy and at sea level and, was able to taper the next week. I wouldn't advise that for other athletes, but I really think that anytime we just have to be so intentional about how we structure pacing into building your programs and running more than honestly 25, running for more than 3 hours, you're really depleting your glycogen stores. That is significant time on feet, and you are putting your body through enough stress that it is going to take some time to recover. Unfortunately, the stress that you are putting on your body is probably not that productive for your training. Yeah. So it's one of those counterbalances of
And that's the number two here for me, Zoe, is I think that, it's great to serve others and to support others through that service. Pacing, crewing, wonderful things. We do it for each other. We do it for our friends. But your training is your training, and I wouldn't personally put forth my limited time in a calendar year to do an ultra during someone else's ultra.
Yeah, I can really only go beyond 30 miles so many times healthfully in a season for me,
Yeah.
and like with my time, with my recovery ability. And I really only want to do that like when it is for me. I'm glad to like give my time away in different increments. You know me, I identify as being a people pleaser in recovery. I actually had a friend a couple years ago reach out to have me crew her at the Moab 240. And I was like, oh my gosh, that sounds awesome. I've always wanted to like help out at a 200-mile race. What are the logistics? And when she sent me the fact that I would possibly be pacing her for 8 to 10 hours, I was like, girl, I'm so sorry, but like, I can't do that. I can't, like, I physically am not in a place where I'm able to safely offer that in a way where it really feels like I'm giving you what you need.
Yeah.
And so I think that athletes always need to assess like, what resources do I have, and know that your energy and your ability to go a certain distance is a resource, and you don't owe that to people.
Agreed.
Oftentimes people will be fine if you set a boundary and you say, well, actually, I'm not comfortable doing 40 miles. I can do 20, which is great. And that's an amazing thing to be able to offer. I also think the longer I think that you should feel good saying no about stuff like that. It's hard, like having to turn my friend down for the Moab 240 really sucked.
Yeah, but I think, like, honestly, if your friend isn't aware, like,
Correct.
they should be very aware of
they
what they're
knew
asking
like what they
you
were
to do.
asking was big. Like they weren't like, they're not stupid. They were like, I know this is a big ask and it's okay for you to say no. So I just would really encourage athletes, like, as with like all crewing and pacing things, there are ways that you can support people without backburnering your own ambition. And I think it's always important to approach with self-awareness. Am I someone who tends to habitually put other people before myself, potentially as a means of not getting vulnerable? That might be a good sort of place for inquiry. Or if you're someone who's like, I always put myself first, that could be a great, like, maybe volunteer to pace your friend and experience being a part of someone else's crew if that's sort of the side of things you tend to fall on.
Yes, for a reasonable amount of time that doesn't require weeks of your own personal recovery. And also, it's risky to run an ultra.
Yes.
And so I can't imagine.
It's like it's really hard on your body to go that distance, no matter how good you are, no matter how good of shape you're in. It is a significant demand on your body. I think that people should be really judicious with that.
Agreed.
I can't make that decision for them,
Nope.
but I can invite people to understand that it is good and okay to say no and set boundaries and to really take into context what is being asked of you.
I feel like you said that so well, Zoe. Now talk to me about heat training.
HIIT training.
HIIT.
High intensity
High
interval training. This is how I know you haven't been in a gym in like 10 years.
I've done CrossFit once in
did it one
Argentina.
time?
It was 100% in Spanish.
How was that?
I wore my S-Labs.
Hell yeah.
And it was fine.
I was the only person there with the
fine.
hydration vest on. So high intensity interval training, you usually see this in the context of like 20 to 30 minute workouts or like sort of like a cross training thing where you see sessions of all out effort. So like usually doing like you'll have burpees for like 1 minute or like as many squat jumps as you can in a minute. And this is something that we see a lot in the fitness world. And I really discourage runners from doing it because the sort of like the aerobic intensity is going to be counterproductive to your recovery. Like that is a lot of, again, we always want to think about stress in terms of productive or counterproductive. Doing intentional targeted weight training that assesses and addresses your specific imbalances, that is productive stress. It is still stress and we have to treat it as such. Randomly doing a shit ton of burpees for no fucking reason, non-productive stress. High intensity interval training is not formed with runners in mind. It often will make you more tired and more sore than is productive for your running. So I'm a not on HIIT training.
All right. Doing hill workouts on a treadmill.
Hot.
Yeah,
I think it's a great tool for runners to have in their back pocket. I've fully been like tread pilled in my time. I used to be one of those people who's proudly was like, I'll run in a fucking snowstorm. I don't care. I'm not running inside. Now I'll you can find me on Fridays just absolutely vibing at the Carbondale Rec Center with all the senior citizens, just like out of my mind, listening to Cardi B jamming on the treadmill. But I think what's great about a treadmill is you can really control the settings. So like ramping up your hill workout to be that exact 6 to 8% incline and then doing that recovery nice and easy on the flat. You really get to control the effort. And a lot of times that'll make you run a more consistent effort, which I really like. You get to control the environment. You get to really like dial in a lot of things, and it can be lighter impact because there's no downhill on the treadmill.
For sure. And if you're kind of a city-based athlete without a lot of access to hills, this is a great way to work on your uphilling and get some race-specific adaptations down. I'm all about the uphill treadmill workout.
Yeah, same. We're giving it a hot from both of us.
Hot.
Yeah.
We had a couple colds. Now we got a hot. Splitting your runs up. Ooh, what does this mean? What does it mean to split your run up?
So what I'm thinking of is like if I assign an athlete 6 miles, but they have a meeting at like 8 a.m., so they decide to do 4 miles in the morning and 2 miles in the afternoon. Should athletes do that?
I think that's not the optimal stress.
Correct. Yeah.
And
so
it's great to be flexible and love that. Want to advocate for that all the time. But when I see athletes who split their runs up, quite often, they're losing out on that aerobic stress.
Correct.
Like the greater stress is when you do all 6 miles at once.
Because it compounds throughout the duration of your workout. So it's like not all miles are created equal. And if you go and run 10 miles at a time versus 10 miles, like run a mile, rest an hour, run a mile, rest an hour, like obviously that will be experienced by your body as different stress. Using our heuristic of productive and non-productive stress, that's going to be a less productive stress because you're not getting the adaptations that you want of like that ability to, use glycogen, that ability to build aerobic endurance, to force those mitochondrial adaptations. So, there are times where splitting up runs can be helpful for athletes. I would say like once in a blue moon, maybe we can do it. But if I have an athlete that's habitually splitting things up, particularly if they're shorter distances, oftentimes I think it's just more productive to rest rather than going and trying to do 3-4 miles in the afternoon.
And I think there's, maybe the one caveat I see to this is like that athlete who, might have a big run in mind. They go to a trailhead and it's like trailhead and they start the run and they get to that trail junction 20 minutes in and it's closed.
Yeah.
And then they have to like go somewhere, get in a car and go somewhere entirely different just to like actually do that run. And in those situations, I actually prefer the athlete try to do almost the whole duration of their originally assigned run instead of being like, it's 20 minutes and then it was 60 and that's how I got my 80.
Right.
If you can, because again, the greater stress is doing all 80 of those minutes. Like
consecutively.
Right. And I love the flexibility when people are like, I got someplace, it didn't work out, I had to bail or, and start the run over later. And, depending on how you're feeling and the time involved in traveling and what you have available, if you can do, all the minutes that you were prescribed or all the miles you were prescribed at once, great. It's not always possible for athletes, but that kind of flexibility in splitting up things I love rather than just being like, I got to the trailhead, ran for 20 minutes, didn't go. Because X, Y, and Z, so I didn't get the run in at all.
Yeah, and we always want to force athletes out of the make-up miles mentality, which is this mentality of like, I can always do it later. I can always do it later this afternoon, or I can always do it tomorrow. So it's really not that important that I get out this morning or that I get out today. I think oftentimes if you delay like, I can do this later, you're letting yourself off the hook. And you're delaying your recovery. So like you're going to have less impactful training, less impactful recovery. There can be times where sometimes we can switch workouts around without significantly changing the stress stimulus. But a lot of times it doesn't respect the intention of the training formula. And that's where I have a problem of always if you always think like, I don't need to do this now, it's okay if I don't. I think that's not a very strong position to approach your training from.
Approach anything.
Right. Of like, I'll buckle down tomorrow. Well, the best time to buckle down is right the fuck now.
A reasonable sense of urgency around your training is probably pretty important.
Right. And then if you miss training, like, let yourself off the hook. Like, if you miss it, life gets crazy, you don't feel good, take a 0 day, you know? Like, don't take a 0 day and then like think that you can just like make it up the next day. Again, oftentimes if you need to take that day off, you should take both of those days off, you know?
Agreed. That double rest.
Yeah.
Huge. Athletes often know that, and they're having trouble with that. A lot of that not enough kind of mentality coming through, and it's a great opportunity to work on that.
And like, I think that oftentimes we see the people who are too flexible in that way often are the least consistent.
Oh, you just need to be narrow just enough.
Yes.
Just
rigid enough.
We'll have an identity call here soon. We'll talk all about that. Okay. Talking about Leadville, it is the Leadville 100 race week. You're excited.
Pumped.
It's all over the news. You're hearing it more and more. CNN, MSNBC, they're all covering the Leadville 100 right now. How are you approaching your planning for this event? We've kind of gone back and forth on our Slack channel with our team of athletes, talking about like different ways that you can make your spreadsheets and figure out your nutrition plan.
I think this is a great opportunity to plug joining, if you're not already a member of Microcosm, joining the Foothills tier, which is only $10 a month with the code Foothills10. You get access to conversations like this, and you can get feedback from coaches one-on-one. I actually shared like a sample 100-mile race plan, complete with a nutrition strategy and complete with like how to calculate times between aid stations. So that's the sort of value that our team members get when they are active in our community.
No, it's awesome because like a lot of people, especially for their first ultra, they don't really know how to approach this. And I don't think it's like super intuitive the first couple times, but with a little bit of help and hopefully with this kind of conversation, people will get a better idea of that. So how do you set it up? Like, where do you start?
So, I really try to sort of, and this is one of the reasons like 100-mile races are a pursuit of mastery sort of situation. You can't walk up to the start line of your first 100-mile race and really like without having done a lot of other racing and think that you have a really good idea of what you can expect.
Right.
This is my 5th 100-miler. I've been doing this since 2018. I have a good bit of background and knowledge, about this distance, but also historically about how I race at altitude, how I race in this terrain, how I've trained and raced on this course historically. And all of that knowledge went into formulating my specific plan.
For sure.
So I think that like the big thing, like zooming out, part of creating a race plan is gathering data, and that is something that just happens over the course of years and years and years, and not days and months. So
to have a good race plan, you have to train for years and years and years.
No, but it's definitely helpful, right? Like that's the sort of like how else do you know? It's sort of like, well, I'm capable of running a 50-miler in this amount of time. Therefore, I should be approximately capable of running a similar 100-miler in similar terrain and altitude in this time.
Right.
So it's experience, right? Like
makes the difference.
That it doesn't just make the difference; it's the most important data. Another way that I like to do this is I look at historical times and I see women that I've competed with and know well. And I sort of look at what they are approximately doing and try to piece together like, okay, it looks like they struggled in this section, so I'm not going to use those splits. And then sort of like piece together what I think I'm capable of to give my crew a rough approximation of when I'm going to show up at aid stations. And again, that comes from experience. I usually base splits like on people I know, people I've talked to, people I can shoot a text to and say like, hey, what did you think about this section? How can I plan through it? And again, that's something that just takes a lot of research, and that is not something my coach did for me, and it's not something your coach should do for you, because being able to own your plan and do the research required to build this will make you a more empowered and equipped athlete on race day.
Independent athlete.
Yeah. How did you formulate your race plan for Western States?
I used a really similar approach.
Yeah.
And folks can refer to that because we talked about it here on the pod. But I think, more than about me or about you, I think we've driven home the point that experience matters. But we have folks who are, teeing up to a Leadville for the first time, or teeing up to an ultra for the first time, going through this process. I've been working with a couple athletes who are running their first ever ultras this year, and developing, that spreadsheet and putting it all down to approximate those times and things, and understanding how to use the aid stations effectively and all this stuff is just so new to them. So what would you, what kind of advice, like for approximating pacing and times, what kind of advice would you give athletes? Like, how should they help? What can help them guide that process?
I just, like, I've always based my race plans on past experience. I don't know that if you don't have that data where you would, otherwise I think you're just pulling numbers out of your ass. Well, how do you guide people that have never done it?
And I think you said it right there, past experience. But I think the way to look at that is to look at the training history.
Right.
I think that's the relevant experience.
Okay. So like on similar terrain, at similar altitude, on ideally your long run, or like, and again, knowing like if you are running your easy pace honestly on a lot of days and you run your easy effort over similar terrain, that can be an informed place to like get an approximate idea from. Like most of us are going to be running something that blew my mind is I ran Rio del Lago, which is like a fairly flat sea level 100-mile race. I ran that, my splits at that 100 were faster than the splits I train with on Red Hill, which is a local trail system, just because it's so annoying and technical. So like there are ways where it's like, okay, maybe your easy days aren't like depending on the terrain and like some other factors. That's not the best way to base your splits. But if you're like most days running in similar-ish terrain and you're like, yes, I am definitely running easy, that can give you an idea of what your pace is, and then maybe dial it back a little bit because you are running 100 miles, and a lot of people do.
Maybe dial it back.
Dial it back a little bit, and that can give you an idea as well.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we see. I don't want athletes to plan on a slowdown. I do not encourage athletes to plan on a slowdown. Because I think if you execute well and you stick to your nutrition plan and you're well trained for something, a slowdown is not inevitable.
Yeah, I would agree. 100 miles, though, I think for everybody there's a slowdown. Like, look at the Western States men's splits. Everybody slowed down. I think
not a significant, like...
Right, I think the important thing to recognize there is, like, just because you're slowing down doesn't mean you're not still putting forth the highest possible effort that you can put out. And that's the real difference. We can talk about mental preparation maybe, too, if we've got time. But what I hear and what maybe I want to convey to athletes here is, one, if you're training correctly in the 8 to 12 weeks before your event, most of your runs are going to be done on race-specific terrain. And so that means...
Or race-similar terrain.
As close as you can get. So elevation, gain, and loss per mile should really be trying to line that up with the runs that you're doing. I like to see that on some easy runs during the week if athletes have the time to do it, but certainly that's a must on the weekend runs. And then, through those experiences, you get an idea on technicality. Sorry, I forgot to mention technicality. If your trails are technical or non-technical, are you racing hard rock or javelina? Like those, if you're racing javelina, don't train on trails like hard rock.
Yeah.
Like it feels obvious, but people do make those mistakes. And then when they look back at their training and they're trying to approximate times, and I made these mistakes very early on in my ultra running career, training on terrain that was just way harder than I was racing on. And then so, telling people
if you train slow, you're going to race slow.
Right. And then but then when you approximate those times, you're like, I'm going to be, I think given X, Y, and Z, what I've done on these runs, I'm going to be here at this time. And then you're like, well, shit, I'm an hour early because like the terrain here is so different. So use your past history. If you've got past race experience, that also can drive the process. And then I think specifically for athletes who are like trying to understand like pacing each segment of the race, let's talk a little bit about that. Like, how do you break your race down when you're approximating times? Are you thinking like times, are you arbitrarily looking at different parts of the course, or are you looking at more aid station to aid station?
I'm looking at aid station to aid station, and again, this comes from like I have projected most of this course and run every inch of it historically. Like I ran Hope Pass, and I know approximately how long it takes me to run just Hope Pass, and I will run it at a different effort during the race than I ran in training, but it does give me sort of an idea of what my approximate pace will be in that section, which is very distinctive versus other sections of the race, which are quite flat and non-technical. So I don't think that it's good to look at like, I expect my average pace to be 11-minute miles. Like,
Right.
Well, sure, but like if it's something like Leadville where, 80% of the race is fast and flat and then 20% of it is steep as hell, like that's going to knock your splits off. So I always look at how much gain and loss there is between aid stations to help me inform where I'm going to be running faster and where I'm going to be running slower.
And are you thinking about like RPE at all in that, or do you work with athletes at all on like how to manage their effort in those
run
terms?
easy.
Run easy.
Yeah, that's how you manage your effort, is you run fucking easy.
Yeah, I think so too. But what about for like a high performing athlete who wants to push themselves? Like clearly you're not going to be running just easy at Leadville if you want to do well.
Right, but I planned aggressive splits for myself. Splits, I know what time I need to run in order to be competitive. I looked at what it would look like to reverse engineer that. I looked at athletes who historically have run similar times and what their splits were, and I used that to formulate my race plan because I believe I'm capable of that. I have evidence that suggests I'm capable of that, and it's also what I need to do to meet my A goal of being competitive.
Nice. So I love the clarity around that. So you're starting off, you've got a spreadsheet, it breaks it down.
Aid station to aid station.
Yeah, and then so with that, you also have the approximate time it's going to take you to run those segments. And so I'm assuming that's how you then formulate what you're going to need for nutrition and hydration in those segments.
That's right. And I think something that I really worked on is really dialing in my nutrition plan over the course of the summer. And my goal is to eat 80 grams of carbohydrate every hour, starting to integrate some real food fueling in the form of potatoes around mile 40, just to mix things up and prevent sweet fatigue. And I've our nutritionist Kylie encouraged I incorporate a little more whole food sooner on, and I trained with potatoes and they worked well. And just really dialing that in. I know that it will work for me because that's what I've trained with. I'm not using anything new. I'm not doing anything different. It's a lot of gels because I primarily use gels rather than like drink mixes. I do use a hydration mix, but primarily just for hydration and not as a significant source of my carbohydrate. So again, knowing that I want to get 80 grams of carbohydrate an hour in my spreadsheet, you can see I gamed out, okay, if it's 3.5 hours from this aid station to aid station, this is how many grams of carbohydrate I need to consume in that time. And then I break it down into, okay, I'm going to consume this many gels and I'm going to consume this many carbohydrates via liquid fuel, or this many carbohydrates through tater tots, really gaming out exactly how many tater tots I need to eat in order to get 19 grams of carbohydrate, how many ounces of mashed potato I would need to get to eat to get 19 grams of carbohydrate. Looking specifically at the difference between mashed potatoes and tater tots is 400 milligrams of sodium different in a serving.
Wow,
so making sure that I know that when I take in tater tots, I'm not also like jamming on Element. So that fitting all the pieces of the puzzle together, looking at making sure I'm meeting my 80 grams of carbohydrate goal, I'm meeting my 20 ounces per hour of fluid goal, and 500 milligrams of sodium per hour goal.
So when you go through that process, then do you total up the total intake of calories and total intake of sodium for the entire duration of how long you think, and match that up with how long you think you're going to be out there to make sure you've got enough calories in the bags and everything?
Yes, and I always add a couple, I always make sure in my drop bags, my crew gives me a couple gels, just in case, if I slow down if something happens. Like, I don't ever want, I don't think it's important to go fast, and like, you don't want a tough day to turn into a crisis, right?
Yep.
So I always make sure I have like a little bit of a food buffer, and that there's also like, if shit hits the fan, there's things that I've tried throughout the course of my career that I can reach for at aid stations too.
I mean, it sounds, I know for you this is so dialed, so it's probably not for you as complicated as it sounds. But let me ask, with all of the moving parts of this plan, I think particularly like this part's about the tater tots versus the mashed potatoes, and managing that sodium difference when you're tired and it's harder to make decisions. Are you relying, like this is probably a good part to segue over to crew and how you put your crew together. Like, I assume you're going to be relying on your crew to help with those decisions later, because it's going to get harder to manage that. And so how did you put that team together?
Well,
what are the expectations around that?
I created the spreadsheet and I shared it with my crew, and there's lots of notes. And again, I listed out all of the fuel that I've practiced with. I list out everything in my quiver, and I wrote out all of the nutritional information so that my crew has access to that. So they also know how many grams of carbohydrate I'm trying to get and what the pieces of the puzzle that I'm working with are. And I also didn't try to make it overly complicated, like I wanted it to be like, you want there to be a healthy mix of things, because I don't want to just only take in lemonade flavored gels for like 20 hours. I don't want to only eat potatoes for 20 hours, but I do want my crew to be able to aid me when we need to problem solve it and when we need to be flexible. I have the advantage of having a dietitian nutritionist on my crew. Thanks, Kylie.
Building out that team.
Well, I mean,
Love
I always put together a team of people who understand running. They don't have to necessarily be experienced ultra runners. I don't think everyone on our team is an ultra runner, and that's okay. For me, it's really important that there is a mix of like, you've run 100-milers, so you know how to support someone when shit gets weird. Kylie has crewed and paced me at multiple 100-milers and knows how to support me when I'm in a low point or when I'm really trying to hustle and compete. And she can also bring a lot of knowledge about nutrition to the table. I have Kate Donaldson, who's one of my good buddies from Boulder and is a nurse. John Levitt, one of my great buddies from Boulder, is bringing the stoke and bringing like a lot of logistical information and an ability to execute. Like, he gets shit done.
300 grams of ketones.
Yeah.
That's what he's bringing.
He's bringing the ketones.
Not part of your plan.
But ketones are not in my plan. But no, I think that like what I really intentionally built a crew, and also my cousin Chris, who I know and love and will just bring an amazing energy, and is, again, like, I picked people who I just know are like, on my best day and on my worst day, they can handle whatever happens, including you. And again, like, I like to pick people who know their shit about running. Like, my dad wanted to come out and watch, and I was like, you're welcome to come out and watch, but like, you're not on the crew because you do not have the skills required to help me do what I need to do on this particular day. Like, we turned people down, right? Because like, we only get 4 crew passes, and I'm so popular. There were more than 4 people that wanted to be on my crew. Consummate people pleaser is hard for me, but I had to tell some people, actually, like, I had to be very intentional about how I built this team up.
Totally. If you've only got those 4 spots, very different from Western states in what I was able to do, which is cool. I love that contrast.
Yeah, but I mean, you'll also notice in my plan, I was very transparent about what my A goal was, what my B goal was, what my C goal was, and my D goal. I wrote that out so that my crew can see that, so that we can think together about how to facilitate that. And I really coach my crew up on how to calm me down when I rip into aid stations like an out-of-control hurricane, how to pump me up if I get in my head, how we can address certain issues, and just really help, like, talked specifically with everyone on my crew and wrote it down about like things that I've run into in the past and how, like, potential challenges we might encounter together, and how I want to show up in the face of those challenges and how we can problem solve together.
Love it. Let's, you brought up these outcome goals, and really specifically, they are results-oriented goals, the least controllable of the goal hierarchy that we have. Before we move on to carb loading, which is going to be something hopefully in the next 24 to 48 hours you're actually moving on to in real life, let's just briefly talk a little bit about your mental prep because, the physical and the mental, they go together. You can't have one without the other. You've talked a little bit here about, you have clarity around the goals you're playing for. How else are you breaking the race down in terms of this mental preparation?
I've really been visualizing moving through different parts of the course, and I visualize how it will feel to move through them on a good day when I'm feeling good. And I've been intentionally visualizing how I will respond when it feels tough, when it doesn't feel good, when I'm not in the position I want to be in, if I'm behind my splits, if I'm throwing up, if I can't eat, if I'm dehydrated, if my feet hurt. I've been visualizing how I want to show up in those moments and specifically what it will feel like to feel like shit power hiking up power line, what it will feel like to feel like shit running the gravel road down from power line, how I'm going to motivate myself when it's midnight and I'm running around Turquoise Lake. How am I going to, no one's watching, no one's cheering you on there, no one can see you. You have to really be able to show up for yourself, and the wrong time to think about that is when it's happening. So I've been really intentional of like not trying to romanticize this, because I feel great in my training. Like I feel like I've been really healthy, been really, really lucky. I have a lot of gratitude coming into this race. But I don't want that to color how I'm thinking about things, because running 100 miles is hard and it is uncomfortable. So I'm making sure that even when during workouts or during runs, when my thoughts drift to like sort of romanticizing, like, oh, I'm just going to be, running so great and the miles are going to come so easy. It'd be great if that happens out there, but I'm not counting on that. And I am counting on needing to draw on the times that I've navigated challenge, the times that I've kept going even when I was tired. And I think that that's been a really big part of my mental preparation too. And drawing on past experiences where I've done that, like at Run Rabbit, running through the night by myself. That's a experience, and loving it. That's an experience that I come back to is, don't be afraid to get weird. Always stay curious about how the next section will feel.
So there's a predominant attitude around curiosity. There's a competence that you've built through experience and a self-efficacy there of doing hard things. And really there's a review process that you're going through of acknowledging these past moments where you have done things that were stretching you, and where you responded the way that you wanted to in those moments. And you're really using that as a tool to increase your self-efficacy, your belief in your ability to do these hard things. That's actually built on the hard evidence, the work that you've done. I think, there's a lot of really good clarity in all that. And again, I'm always, we have 5 psychological skills. All coaches should be able to coach to these things. All athletes should be working on developing these skills. Visualization is one of those key skills, and bringing up those moments, both the good and the bad. But I think something we both know about these races is that, when it's going well, it's going well.
Yes.
And we're, enjoying it. And there's a moment at some point where every athlete has to make a decision. And that decision is, do I stay on my growth edge? And for some people, that's just staying in the race and staying committed to the finish line. And not DNFing. For other athletes, that's, choosing to run when they know they banked well enough time to walk it in and make it, and it could be feeling easier. What are you doing to address the knowledge that will come up for you?
Yeah, so something I think about, and the way that I think about it in my head is I call it the juicy spot. And that's where it's not a default, because usually the early miles, it's no issue for me to run. It's easy. I'm having fun. I'm well trained. I've done this before. There will come a moment that I call the juicy spot where you have to continue to make a decision to stay in it. And we went through this at Silver Rush. I came into one of the aid stations feeling like total shit, just crying because I felt so shitty and so tired. And there was a climb out of that aid station. And I was leaving the aid station. I saw everyone in front of me walking, and I was like, well, let's make the choice to run. It's not the default setting. I could definitely walk this and that would be fine. But I made the choice to push myself and to run into that juicy spot. And that for me is the inflection point where everything is a choice. And that's when you really need to be able to draw on your energy and draw on those mental reserves to continue to compete for me, even when it gets hard, to continue to run things, even when it feels hard, to continue to move forward, even when it feels hard. And realizing that just because it's because it's a choice, you have the power to make a decision there, and that's really, really important. And that's what gives making the harder choice meaning.
That's why, you go through this process of understanding what your process-oriented goals are and your performance-oriented goals are.
Yeah.
That gives you the performance standard, that when it is that juicy point that you're going to run that hill. Mm-hmm. And then that's your way of being. That's how you have predetermined you're going to show up. It was so cool at Silver Rush to see you externalize and then flip the switch back in the direction of who you really wanted to be. And although externalizing maybe was also a facet of that and is important, really the action that was born out of that was that you really ran as well as you possibly could have on a tough day in the last half of that race. And I like that you experienced that, even though it wasn't the outcome you wanted. You needed to have that experience in order to refresh yourself, to know that when that moment comes at Leadville, you can do it.
Right. And I think about like some portion of my training, I train to make shit easy, right? Like when you're well prepared for ultras, it's significantly easier. Like they feel easier. Then there's another portion of my training, the workouts, the long runs, the high volume weeks, where I train to encounter the hard shit. And it's always going to be hard, but I am prepared to make the choice I want to make in those instances.
Extrapolate that out to your life. Oh God. So powerful. I love thinking about it. It's so amazing. Yeah. Imagine showing up
part
like
of
that.
The work goes towards making things easy. The other part goes towards feeling up to the challenge when shit gets hard.
All right. Let's talk about carbo loading.
Yes. So I love carbs. It's no secret in this household. We are big fans of carbohydrates. And I think there's a lot of misperceptions about what carb loading is. Oftentimes I'll hear an athlete say, I had a big plate of pasta at 8 p.m. the night before my marathon. And if that's the first time you're thinking about carbo loading, like, you are severely underserving your glycogen stores. So backing up to talk about carbohydrates, they are the most efficient source of energy production. They're used to produce ATP to power our cells just at the most basic level. This can happen immediately, or carbs can be stored in the liver or muscles as glycogen. Your glycogen stores are important during exercise, as stored carbohydrate is turned back into glucose and used to power working muscles. On average, the storage capacity for glycogen between the liver and muscles is about 1,800 or 2,000 calories, depending on sex, body weight, training status, and diet. Some people can actually increase that up to 3,200 calories. But for most people, that's enough for about 90 minutes to 2 hours of running before hitting the wall. So loading up your glycogen stores before a big event can ensure that you're taking full advantage of having a plentiful gas tank. So the idea, backing up to talk about the history, the idea of the carb load was first studied and established in the 1960s when Scandinavian scientists had a group of cyclists bike to exhaustion and measured their muscle glycogen content. They compared the cyclist performances when they had eaten a high-carb diet prior to their tests with their performances after a low-carb meal. So same athletes, different diet stimulus. When on the high-carb diet, they were able to cycle 3 to 4 times longer. Runners started runners are always a little late to the game versus cyclists. Runners started adding in carb loading on their own a couple decades later, and a protocol developed. A few days of lower carb diet and higher intensity, followed by a few days of lower volume and higher carbohydrate intake. This evolved into many runners just focusing on the pre-race pasta that we talked about, which a lot of times I think just ends up leaving people feeling sluggish, nauseous, and bloated before their event.
Too much, too late.
Too much, too late. So we really want athletes to start, depending on the event. If you're racing a 10K as just part of your normal training, you don't need to go balls to the wall on carb loading, right? It's really for A events, big long events, marathons, ultras, really key moments here. And what we want athletes to do is to shoot for about 5, and there's a big range, right? So think about your goals, think about your body weight. And this is, again, like, a lot of times this stuff does need to be finessed and we have to dial it in with experience and trial and error. But we want athletes to shoot for between 5 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day, starting 3 days before. So for a 150-pound runner, that would be a range of anywhere from 477 to 818 grams of total carbohydrates per day in the 3 to 5 days leading up to the event. So that is a huge range, but that's why we really want to experiment with, ideally, men eating on the higher end of that range, depending on body composition, women maybe, and people in smaller body frames eating on the lower end, and depending on like what feels good to you, what works for you as well.
And I think it's super important just to, remind everybody of like kind of the lead time on this.
Yes.
3 to 5 days. I think typically, what Kylie was recommending for me for Western states was 48 hours out from the event to really be focused on it. But she kept kind of reminding me of don't lose the focus earlier in the week. You should be making that shift over to lower fiber, lower protein. Lower fiber, lower protein, higher carb, and continuing to transition. And I think where a lot of athletes kind of screw this up is that like they get to like that 48 hours and then they're like really pushing like in a couple meals like to get all of those grams of carbs, and so that leaves them feeling like pretty like heavy and bloated. Because so spreading that out really makes a big difference.
Increasing your carbohydrate intake can lead to water retention, especially if you're doing a sodium load, which is a topic for another podcast. But we want to avoid feeling overly bloated and having excessive water retention as well. So a few tips that I wanted to give for how athletes can effectively carbo load. Make sure you're shooting for simple carbohydrates with low fiber. So things like pretzels, white rice, pasta, bagels. Keep it basic.
Juices
and lemonade is a favorite of mine, particularly if we have an athlete that pre-race nerves are a thing. Sometimes tapering can impact your hunger cues if you feel anxious or if you're traveling. Juices and lemonades can be a great way to get in easy carbohydrates.
Even soda, man. Kylie was even telling me like, hey, have a Sprite if you want. Or have some Gatorade, those sugary drinks can really help to boost that up. Obviously, I have a very specific
protocol.
Yes, it's at least 2 to 3 entire things of Abe's mini muffins.
You are the first person to do an entirely mini muffin.
Only mini muffins for 5 days leading up to the race.
But that is a good point. You can use hydration mixes to meet your carbohydrate needs, and that can also help with hydration and electrolytes throughout your event. But again, to avoid excessive fullness, a big thing we like to encourage athletes to do is snack. Spread those carbohydrates out throughout the day, which can make it less intimidating and uncomfortable than trying to get it all in a giant pasta dinner. And I think it's important that athletes plan ahead. You need to know your strategy and carb sources ahead of time. During race week, that is the wrong time to realize you want to get into meal prep and planning.
Yeah, I love to have athletes, especially for hundreds, on the Monday or Tuesday of race week, have all of that finally dialed in. Like by the end of the day, Tuesday, should have everything for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday done, all the logistics done, all of the food and fueling for the race parceled out into their drop bags. Like I like to have it done. That way, then all you have to do is get yourself to the race, rest, and eat.
And I think another thing that's important is you don't want to totally, it's not like you only eat carbs, right? You don't need to just only eat white rice, but you do want to think about reducing your protein, fiber, and fat intake. Just because
I forgot fat. That was what
those things aren't going to be as adeptly utilized as readily available energy.
And they cause GI distress.
And they cause GI, salads, fuck that shit. Not this week. So I wanted to share, Kylie gave me a sample plan for carb loading. So, pay attention to how many snack opportunities there are. But this is Kylie's carb loading sample menu. For breakfast, start with 3 waffles with eggs and a banana. And then for a snack, have a cup of berry banana smoothie plus some instant oatmeal. For lunch, 1 cup of quinoa salad with a medium sweet potato and some applesauce. For another snack, that's snack 2, 20 pretzel sticks with a medium pita and hummus, so a little protein to help with that satiation factor, and to help sort of like, if you just are constantly like boom, 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 eating a ton of high carb, that's going to lead to blood sugar spikes that are just not that helpful for energy. So do think about like adding in just a little bit of fat, just a little bit of protein to help moderate that blood sugar.
Probably could do some work on this.
Yeah, I always try to work with my athletes when we're talking about nutrition on when we're planning ahead on things, when we're thinking about the snacks and meals, how can we take into account, like, yes, we want a lot of carbohydrate. How do we make that energy last longer with blood sugar control?
Just eat more pasta. That's my method.
We got to work on your blood sugar control.
It's bad.
It's out of control.
I'm too happy.
But for dinner, 1.5 cups of basmati rice with veggies and a protein and some naan. So a lot of carb there, but limited fiber, a little bit of protein. And then snack number 3, some Greek yogurt with half a cup of granola for a tasty dessert at night.
All right.
Carb loading.
Love it. It's going to lead to better downhill running.
Downhill running. So this is something we get so many questions about because I think it really is intimidating for athletes of all levels.
Yeah.
Let's just say it. Downhill running is freaking scary. And I think oftentimes that fear causes people to stiffen up, which is actually counterproductive. So do know that like having fear and discomfort around downhill running is totally normal. It's okay. It's something almost everyone works through. And it's okay to acknowledge those feelings as long as you have a strategy to work through it. What I don't think is okay is saying, I'm scared to run downhill, I'm not going to work on it. That's not an appropriate strategy. So what I like to encourage athletes to do is, I call it sessioning or microdosing downhills. So we will implement the psychological principle of priming or microdosing, sessioning, to introduce a stimulus for longer and longer periods of time. So when it comes to running faster down technical terrain, for example, you need to increase your reps just like you would lifting weights in the gym. So I always think about like pushing that envelope a little bit further each time. To practice sessioning, I like to have athletes find a short section that always causes you to slow down and simply repeat it until you can do it more quickly and confidently. Think of this drill as if you were learning dance steps. It's that repetition that builds confidence. This is something you can do on an easy run or even incorporate it as part of a hill workout. If you don't practice specifically, you will remain stagnant and slow. I think that people are always looking for a tip or a hack that like will help them get around the fact that you just have to continue to face your fear. And I think that that sessioning or microdosing can actually help you not only build the physical skills that you need to run better at downhill, but also like help put in your body that like this is an okay thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest things that I see athletes limiting themselves with is their story around downhills. I'm not fast on the down. I'm slow on the down. I don't run well in technical terrain. My balance isn't great. Like I hear that same stuff over and over again from athletes, even athletes who've been running trail for years and years. And that sessioning mentality and repeating those very technical sections over and over again actually is a very successful way of working on improving your downhill. I've done this with a number of athletes who are focusing on hard rock style events. Where those downhills, really, there's very little room for error. Yeah. And if you go too slow on those downhills, you eventually just won't make the cutoff. So you have to move faster. But there is another element to this that I don't want to be overlooked, and that's the visualization process that athletes can do at home when they're not out on the trail. When you are familiar with that section of trail that you're sessioning, then take that home with you. Yeah. And start by just doing 5 or 10 minutes of visualization throughout the day, either like maybe in the middle of the day as a break from work or maybe in the morning before you go out on your run. Find a time that works for you, and in as much detail as you can, bring up the specifics of that environment and that situation, that downhill, that grade, that technicality, and see yourself running it with, the flow you want to have, with the form you want to have, the stability you want to have, with the proper line choice, eyes up and quick feet, limited braking, a smooth, really focus on kind of the highest version of yourself in those moments, because this visualization or rehearsal, you're actually using the same neural pathways you would be using if you're out there running it. So may as well be practicing that when you're not out there. You get twice the practice, and it really does make a big difference.
Yes. And again, I think it's important to like try to reframe your story on running downhill instead of telling yourself, I'm not good at running downhill, or I'm slow at running downhill. I'm working on getting better at running downhill.
Yeah.
I'm building speed on the downhill. I'm addressing my confidence on the downhills, I think is a much more empowered way to think about this.
This helps me grow.
Exactly.
And you can use, when you're in that visualization process, I also recommend athletes like couple that with that self-talk.
Yeah.
That way, when they get to that moment on the trail, then they also have the self-talk to meet that specific segment. And then they're not wrapped up in those old stories that get them to slow down and make them very nervous. And then, it's really like being nervous and not feeling like you have the competence that leads to falls and mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think another big part of downhill running, one of the most important parts of your body that we don't always talk about, is your eyes. Right? The first mistake that newer athletes make is that they're watching what's happening directly under their feet. The habit of looking down breaks good running form, and it prevents you from seeing a patch of slippery rocks, a drop off, or a berm right in front of you.
Yep.
So I really like to have athletes practice looking 10 to 30 feet in front of you as you run. With practice and focus, your brain will take care of the rest. You have to work on building trust through repetition and looking through the obstacles, as your mind has already done the complex calculations of how high to pick up your feet and how hard to push off.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you see this in skiing, because do you ever look directly down at your skis?
It's extremely rare.
Yeah. How do you train your vision to move better downhill? Because I think you're a really great downhill and technical runner, and that likely comes from your years of experience skiing some of the biggest mountains in the world.
You just have to practice developing the proprioception. And so, again, sessioning those trails. And I think it can be helpful if like you start at the top of a section, and you, before running down, you take a second to visualize like what is the path of least resistance here. Like you see a bunch of rocks in a trail, and what I see is the gap between every rock where I put my foot. I don't really see the rocks. I see the space. And that is the key. And if you're looking down the trail far enough, you might see one of those points where like you no longer see space.
Right.
And then that really could be the point where you have to put your foot on a rock.
Yeah.
But you should be avoiding putting your feet on rock, because rock is an uneven, unstable surface. Rather, the ground, you can really count on it.
Yeah.
So,
same with roots.
Right. And so, roots, rocks. So I like to have athletes just start by going to the top of that hill, looking down it and seeing like, where is that path of least resistance? Like, where is the most logical way to get down this?
Yeah.
And then start by trying to follow that line. And that line doesn't begin by looking at your feet. It's more of like, taking in the expanse of what you can see at once.
Thinking about seeing the line and following the line. When I was learning to ski, I had an instructor who made, like, I was being way too timid and way too slow and taking way too many turns, and it was inhibiting because I am also afraid of falling, it took me a little while. I did not grow up on skis, and he made me follow in his tracks to get better at seeing what the more optimal line was, which is usually a slightly braver line than I was naturally inclined to take. So think about taking that braver line, which oftentimes can be that safer line.
And I think another thing that I see athletes doing wrong with this is they feel like, good downhill running is like go really fast to the point where like you're not sure what the line is, and then brake very hard. Yeah. And then look up the trail again and find the line, and then look back down, and then and so you should be taking in the expanse of what's in front of you throughout your descent. And your eyes don't just stay 10 feet in front of you or 30 feet in front of you. Your eyes actually are moving back and forth from a few feet in front of you out and taking it in, so you can take in what's coming, also in relationship to where you're putting your feet. And the brain, like you mentioned, Zoe, and this is proprioception, does a very good job of remembering where those rocks are and how high to pick your feet up. And it requires a lot of focus. So you really have to practice this stuff. But when you practice it and you practice that line and you practice taking it in, it becomes second nature. And so these skills are skills that can be learned.
So a couple of years ago, I went to the Brooks laboratory in Seattle where they build and test footwear, and I got to see how they test. They were working on a new trail running shoe, and the way that they measure how effective a trail running shoe is, they had their athletes run downhill on a section of trail and wear glasses, and they could track the eyesight where the athletes were, and they used how far down the trail the athletes were looking as a proxy for how effective the shoes were. Because if athletes are looking directly at their feet, it means they don't trust their footwear and they do not feel confident. But athletes who are able to look 10 or more feet down the trail, those are athletes who are confidently able to navigate the terrain and they're not feeling like their footwear holds them back. So that's why I really think that eye line is such an overlooked part of running downhill, and that's something you have to train. You can always use like markers, like look at a tree, you could put a flag, you could put a rock on the side of the trail to help really measure and train your eyes to look further down the trail rather than directly at your feet.
I've seen some running coaches put like flags like every few feet down a trail. And then have their athletes like call out the color of the flag to like make sure the athlete is looking, because people just do have a tendency to look at your feet. And we're going to talk about this here, and I don't think we need to, linger on it for too long, but when we look at our feet more, we're not confident. That leads to braking, which leads to more eccentric loading and breakdown in the quads, which leads to, worse running later. So, especially in these longer ultras. So one thing that I like athletes to focus on is a lot smaller steps and slowing down so they don't have to brake as much.
So thinking about braking and the leg strength component of this, while obviously running downhill on trail is different than sort of how beat up we get running on pavement, trail running still generates a lot of impact on the body. Think about jumping off a box onto the ground. When you land, your muscles eccentrically contract to absorb the load. So the more momentum, the more force your body has to absorb. Same rule applies to trail running. The faster you go, the stronger you need to be to control yourself downhill. So fast feet and having that high cadence, like I call them hamster feet, is one of especially when you do it, because you have little like fairy prince footwork. But fast feet are one of the most important parts of technical descending and demands that you have a strong core, strong quads, strong glutes, and a healthy dose of balance. So eccentric contractions can be really demanding on your body, so you'll want to make that a part of your strength training regimen if you feel limited in your downhill running. So the way I like to coach athletes who feel limited in their downhill running on strength work is making sure you're adding in some balance work, right? And that can also be in the form of like, I do single leg deadlifts, which also great for hamstrings, but also helps with balance. Most single leg exercises do. Yoga can be a component of that. Using the Mobo board can be a component of that. So add in balance work. Plyometrics can be useful in this circumstance. You might like lunges, or I think lunges are the most ideal plyometric for this. And static holds can also be game changers if you're focused on building leg strength. And I think another really overlooked part of this is core strength. Something I say over and over again is you can't fire a cannon from a shaky canoe. And if your core is unstable, you're fighting the wiggle of your own body. So you need to have a stable trunk to be able to have leg strength from. Your core is essential for balance and stability. So I think another thing that's important is that keeping up your speed can be critical, and knowing how to adjust your speed by dropping your hips is crucial so you don't overrun a segment and get yourself in a heap of trouble. You need to know how to brake efficiently. You don't want to spend your quads, right? You don't want to lose a bunch of time and energy and blow your quads up just by slowing yourself down. So brake by lowering your hips instead of trying to scuff your feet. Braking with your feet alone puts you one poor foot placement away from a bad fall. And a cue that I like to give athletes is to get dancy. Sometimes I feel like when I'm running downhill, I look like one of the things that you put in front of like a car dealership with the arms. Allowing your arms to be loose and a little bit flaily counterbalances your lower body's downhill movement. So you're using your upper body limbs as a counterweight to your lower body limbs. And again, you need to have a strong core in order to do that. So think about having a relaxed upper body with a slight forward lean. Avoid taking too much of a back seat because that's going to make it harder for you to quickly shift your center of gravity in response to the terrain.
Yeah.
Another drill I like to have people think about, or another cue, is ninja steps. Think about like how you would run if you're trying to sneak up on someone, because if your footsteps sound loud and like an elephant, you're probably putting a little too much force into that step and you might be over braking. So think about running quietly and softly like a ninja with good turnover.
Yeah, and I think lastly with those quick little steps, another reason why is so you don't overemphasize any one step over the other, because when you're running downhill in technical terrain, there's just inherently a lot of unstable steps.
Yeah.
So if you're always just moving onto that next step, you're much less likely to like sprain an ankle or take a fall.
Yeah.
So that's, really another reason why those little steps are so important.
That's right. And also falling is part of it. We've all fallen on trail. If you're never falling, it probably means you're not pushing yourself quite enough. If you're falling all the time, that might mean we have a problem that we need to talk about. There could be an imbalance or like a neuromuscular. Yeah, you might need to talk about getting some glasses. But if you absolutely never fall because you're just too scared to fall, so you always slow yourself down, that might mean you're a great candidate for microdosing on hills, not anything else. Another sort of counterintuitive thing, and sort of the last tip I'll give on hills, is keep your speed. You may feel like you need to slow down to focus on these changes, but you should actually try to maintain a pretty consistent pace on the downhills. Again, thinking quick, light feet. When you go down slowly, you put all of your weight and stability into the environment below your foot. And if that environment changes, like TJ said, you don't have the ability to rapidly shift your balance and stability. And again, I think that's something that like we see skiers and mountain bikers do really well, is they know how to use that momentum. And we want to think about doing that in trail running as well. Momentum and speed can be our friend. So it's usually when our speed changes dramatically that we get into trouble.
All right. Well, I hope you guys found that helpful. If you've got a topic you'd like us to get into on one of these podcast episodes, reach out. Let us know. We love to hear from you. Microcosmcoaching@gmail.com, microcosm-coaching.com.